Our presenter tonight, Justin Panson, is the Senior Marketing Manager of HMC Architects. He's an amazing writer, so that's how this all started, his writing skills. He runs his own private studio called Confluence Studios, and he has been a marketing manager of business entities in Sacramento for the last 25 years, and so that's kind of his roots. And I want you to think about the timing of all this, right? In the turning point of the history of race relations in the United States, starting with Earl Warren and Brown versus Board of Education. So I now proudly give you Justin Panson.
All right, thanks very much, Greg. And thanks to the Historical Society for this opportunity to present this story, which is so near and dear to me. I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and went to Penn State. And after school, I worked in advertising for a couple of years in New Jersey. And I ended up heading west. Back in the late 80s, the coal and steel industry in the Rust Belt was collapsing, so I was part of a diaspora of people who headed west and into the Sun Belt for better economic opportunities. And there was some adventure there for me as well. I'd never been west of Ohio, so I made it out here and met Megan, who's here tonight, and married, settled in East Sac, raised 3 kids. And I want to talk a little bit about this story I'm going to tell. It's a small story, admittedly, but the large stories of history, the breakthroughs, the wars, the leaders, the great migrations, the pivotal moments in public life are made of small stories. And I just find that is a really interesting dynamic. So this little story ends up mattering. It's an unlikely story of 2 guys who happened to meet at just the right time in history. They were in the right place at the right time. So here are the 2 guys. We've got Pat Patterson on the left and Earl Warren on the right. In terms of Pat, you know, from his seemingly small role in life, his low station in life, he helped to shape the arc of 20th century history, American history. And that seems like a big statement, but the record supports that. Warren was a towering judicial figure, and he did one of the rare things in public life. He migrated his perspective and his opinion a great distance from where it had been to where it ended up. I'm going to back up and talk a little bit about how I encountered this story. Megan and I bought our first place in East Sacramento here, and here's a little detail view. We were on 41st Street, just north of H. That little pink area is Mercy Hospital. It's now called Dignity. And the Swanson's Cleaners is over there, as well as the Temple Coffee. I'm sure there's a lot of folks that are familiar with that. It's only about a mile or so from where we are right now. And this is in like 95. And here we are in front of our first home, proud, and with my brother and our dogs and everything. And here's a shot of us back in the mid 90s with our oldest daughter, Audrey. I'm here to just show you family photos tonight, basically. There's no history, but look how hopeful we were 30 years ago. A lot of the people on that block had moved in the 40s and 50s, and they were getting up in years. And we were the young new people on the block. We met everybody, and we noticed right away there were a lot of African Americans living on this block. And East Sac is mostly white, and so this was an anomaly. And we're asking around, why is this? And it turned out that this block, and here's some of the neighbors on the block. There's Vera and Agnes. Vera lived the house that you see on the left, a little shotgun shack that had been torn down since, and Agnes Murphy was on the house on the right. So this block is the only place African Americans could purchase homes in the time of redlining. There were probably 7, 8, 9 African American families at that time, and that was very interesting. I know everyone knows about redlining, but I got a slide here that just is a little bit of a review. It was a practice that was created by the Homeowners Loan Corporation back in 1933, ostensibly to rate mortgage risk in various neighborhoods. But it had the effect of institutionalizing racial segregation and limiting home ownership opportunities for black families and minority families. And so that's what was happening. The little star there is our block, and this is an actual redlining map from that era. That practice was outlawed in '68 by the Fair Housing Act that prohibited discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin Megan and I really spearheaded several block parties over those years back on 41st Street. And we were the young kids, and everybody, the older folks loved it. So we all got out on the street and had a good time. And that is when I first met Pat Patterson, and he's there on the right. And his wife, Marge, is on the left. And I know there are some people here in the room who knew Pat and Marge. And the woman in the middle was one of the Sisters of Mercy. And right next to us, there was a Sisters of Mercy, still there, facility that was associated with the Catholic Church and Sacred Heart. And I got a chance to have a long conversation with Pat back then. And he's just this elderly man sitting on a lawn chair. And I was struck by his beaming smile and his bright eyes and his big, gentle spirit. And you could tell immediately that this is a special guy. And I had heard from the neighbors that he worked for Warren, and he confirmed that, but he didn't really go into detail. He was a modest guy, and we had some great conversations on this day and other days. And one other thing, you can kind of tell in this picture, he kind of carried himself like an athlete, the way he carried his body, and he just had this really interesting manner. And that's how I first came to know Pat, and this is where Pat and Marge lived, right across the street from us in a modest little place that they probably bought in the 40s. You know, I had heard from the neighbors that he worked for Warren, and they used to pull up in the governor's Cadillac limousine onto the block back in that era, and the neighbors were very proud of Pat for this reason, and it was great. We went to dinner at their house one time, and they were just lovely people. And the thing I remember about that dinner is it was very traditional the way that it went down. Pat and I sat in the living room, and the ladies prepared the dinner in the kitchen. And their house was filled with old kind of knickknacks of older folks, and we were, much younger at the time. It was a lovely night. And then we moved off the block and bought a house just a couple blocks away. Had a couple more kids. We've got 3 kids. We've got our careers going. We're hanging with the school families at this point. And so we lost touch with the people on 41st Street. And at one point, we heard that Pat had passed away, and then we heard Marge passed away. We didn't go to the funerals, and I regret that. And life just kind of moved on. And at some point along the way, the story of Pat just stayed with me. And I, at one point, just went Googling after Pat Patterson just to see what I could find. I don't know why. And I found some mentions in the Warren biographies, and he had worked at Sac State, and we'll get into that a little later. Then I found some of Warren's papers are in the Bancroft Library at the University of California in Berkeley, and I found an archive there. There was a transcript of an interview with Patterson that was done by one of Warren's biographers, Ed Cray, I believe. And that document was really exceptional. It was stunning to me because it spoke about everything that Pat was too modest to talk about. This is kind of the heart of it. Not only were the two of them close, but they shared a deep relationship, both personal and intellectual. Pat was the governor's confidant, and he was one of the people who controlled access to him. As the governor of California, people like Senator John F. Kennedy would call on Warren and other luminaries of the time, and Pat was right in the middle of that whole scene. So it was really, there was a lot more to his role with Warren than I had understood. In that archive, it came out that as his driver and his bodyguard, when Warren needed to think, he would have Pat drive. They would take long drives out in the countryside, in the foothills. And Pat said they often didn't know where they were going. They would just be driving. And that's just an interesting thing to think about. They would also visit high school football games. They both loved sports. And so that was in the record as well. It was recorded that Pat, in his good-natured way, spoke about the race question with Warren, and repeatedly exposed Warren to the inherent rightness of racial equality. And he shared stories about growing up in New Orleans. Pat conveyed to Warren how it felt to be excluded from things, and this was a perspective Warren simply hadn't been exposed to. A little background on Warren: he was the Attorney General, and before he became governor, he was known as a progressive Republican. He was sort of a law and order guy. He supported government reform and public welfare. History looks back, and there's sort of a mixed record. He advocated for efficiency and fairness in government. He also supported interning the Japanese during World War II. That was a decision he later regretted. But I bring this up because that was his context. And so to be exposed to somebody like Patterson on civil rights was just a perspective that Earl Warren did not have at the time. And this is from the Ed Crabe biography. I'm going to read a couple passages. And this is Pat talking. He said, "One day sitting under a tree in the mountains, Patterson mused, 'You know, you and I, we would not be here if you were black.' 'What do you mean?' Warren asked. 'Your life would have been different. You never would have been governor. You never would have been attorney general. Your whole life would have been different.' And the black chauffeur and nominal bodyguard told Warren of black college graduates working on garbage trucks or as waitresses because there was no other jobs open to them, whites-only hotels, and how little had changed from Patterson's boyhood in New Orleans. And to quote, he said, 'We discussed how slow the country was getting rid of discrimination, and I told him that when I was a little boy, I had to pass by a white school to get to my school, and I knew I would have to either fight or run.' In the Berkeley interview, Pat said, 'I think from his Brown decision that was handed down, one part of that decision almost quoted the ideas that he and I used to talk about on Feelings.' And that just blows me away that they had this conversation and we have a record of it, and that these two guys from radically different backgrounds are sitting under a tree somewhere out in the foothills and talking about these things and what that would eventually translate into. And I've tried to imagine, this is from the story that I wrote, I've tried to imagine the conversations in the governor's car, Pat appealing to Warren's reason and his sense of humanity. And to me, it struck me as some kind of true life Driving Miss Daisy tale, and with the fate of millions of Pat's brothers and sisters hanging in the eventual balance. I'm a romantic, so maybe this is romanticized. I find this really remarkable. Now, I mentioned that this story is somewhat lost, and this little clip from the early 2000s from a newspaper down in Southern California, a reporter had written about this relationship. So it was not totally lost. There's plenty of record of it out there, but I just wanted to, for context, include that other people have looked at this story. So Pat worked for Governor Warren from 42 to 53, and this is a shot of the family, a posed shot, a fairly well-known couple of shots of them moving into the governor's mansion down on 16th and H. Their 6 children are there, Virginia, Dorothy, Nina, Earl, Robert here, and James, who was from Mrs. Warren's first marriage, whom they adopted. When he became governor, he asked him to be his driver and his security guy, and he was with the family, and he helped raise the children and drive them around, and he was integral to the family. This is Nina. She had, on the left, she had a polio attack, and here's Pat with the Warrens and pushing the wheelchair, and a shot on the right with the governor, and he's right there behind him. And the Warrens saw potential in young Pat Patterson. They encouraged him to continue his education, and there is a mention of Pat often being down in this little kiosk at the foot of the staircase in the governor's mansion studying, poring over books. And that's just really neat that these guys saw what was in this guy and encouraged him. And this is presumably the car that they drove around in, the Cadillac from this looks like the late 40s. I love the shot. You just get a sense of that time period of history. Now this next one is the only shot of the two of them, just the two of them, not in a group situation. And I just love this shot. They're, it's a stage shot, but you can just tell that they're pretty close here. Pat was a state trooper prior to his service for the governor, and this is a shot from the late 30s. And I believe we found that he was the first African-American state trooper in California in the 30s. Those jobs were not available to African Americans at the time, so he was really a maverick in that regard. The story of how Pat and Warren started their friendship is kind of interesting. Warren was the Attorney General, and Pat was sitting at a table in some government building. He had the Bible opened on the table, and then beside it he had the civil codes open. And Warren came by and he said, "What are you doing?" And Pat said, "I'm trying to reconcile God and law." And it was a pithy comment, and Warren appreciated that. And it's interesting that really is what launched their friendship. And Pat had that kind of quick mind. I mean, even in his later years when I knew him, he had that really active mind. Unlike today, where every single thing we do is recorded on social media, back in Pat's younger days, there wasn't that kind of record. So we don't know a lot about how he got from New Orleans to California, but we were able to find a few photos, and this is Pat on the right. This is a fairly early shot. I don't know when this is from. We do know he was a track star at Sac High, and here are some clippings from that era, and that explains why I could tell that he was an athlete when I saw him even when he was 85 years old. Pat, like a lot of guys of that era, he started his career in military service, and here he is in the Navy. And that was a way that guys were able to launch their careers and become successful. And so he went from the military to the state troopers and then working for Warren. So in '53, President Eisenhower, the war hero from World War II, had a chance to appoint a new Supreme Court justice, and it was the Chief Justice. This is a big opportunity. Presidents are always trying to select somebody who's aligned with their political philosophy. Eisenhower chose Warren, and he famously later said it was the biggest damn fool mistake I ever made. And the reason for that is Eisenhower was a kind of a status quo centrist Republican, and he believed that in picking Warren, he was picking somebody aligned with him. And it turned out that Warren's thinking on race and a whole spectrum of issues evolved significantly from what the centrist president had expected. So it turned into this Eisenhower versus Warren thing a little bit. Eisenhower believed in incremental change, and that was just unacceptable to African Americans who had waited so long for equality and civil rights. And Warren, by contrast, began to recognize racism for what it was and that it had to be dealt with. And this last statement is I found somewhere in one of my readings, and the idea that Warren engineered the boldest stroke against segregation since, you can say, Reconstruction or the Civil War, whatever you want to say, and that's a big statement. The Brown versus Board of Education decision happened shortly after Warren joined the court. And this started in Topeka, Kansas. An African-American family wanted to send their children to a white school. It was closer, it was probably a better school. They weren't able to. They took it to court, and it went all the way to the Supreme Court. That case was joined by 4 other cases in other states. And so they heard arguments, and they were in a deliberation period. When a jurist is in deliberation, you're not supposed to talk to them. You're supposed to let them do their thing and give them space. At that time, Eisenhower invited Warren to what was called a stag dinner at the White House. And in that era, a stag dinner was, the women weren't there. It was just the men. And so he seated Warren next to the Southern delegation, including an attorney from South Carolina who had argued the segregationist position in the Brown versus Board case. Warren, immediately recognized what was happening. At the end of the dinner, Eisenhower grabs Warren by the arm in front of this Southern delegation, and he says, look, at these Southern boys aren't so bad after all. They just do not want their sweet young girls to be in school and have to sit next to a big black buck. That's a terribly racist thing. It goes back to the time of slavery, and it's something that a overseer might have said. And completely inappropriate that a president of the United States would say that to this Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And at that moment, Warren included that episode in his autobiography. It had such an impact on him. And I think probably from that moment, he realized the battle lines were drawn and that Eisenhower was in one camp and Warren was formulating a different approach, a different way on civil rights. So Brown versus Board in '54 is a seminal part of American history. The decision struck down segregation in public schools. It was later expanded to strike down racial classification in many areas, and it paved the way for several other major reforms of the next 10, 15 years. Warren understood that he needed a unanimous decision. So there's a lot of stories about his maneuvering behind the scenes at the court to get that final vote to be 9-0. He knew politically, he was savvy enough politically to know that the country needed a unanimous decision on this in order for it to have the force that he wanted it to have. The real question was, would the South obey? Would they go along with the law of the land? And that was a real open question. And that test came in '57, and it happened in Little Rock, Arkansas. It was a showdown. The governor in Arkansas was this guy, Orville Fabras. So the school board in Little Rock voted to desegregate, and Fabras sent the local guard in to prevent African American students from attending Central High School there. It ballooned into a big showdown, and Eisenhower had to get on national TV and explain it to the American public. But in the end, Eisenhower did the right thing. He enforced the law of the land. He ended up calling in 1,000 troops from the 101st Airborne Division, and they escorted what came to be known as the Little Rock Nine, these 9 African American students who wanted to enroll in Central High School, and they were able to. And it's a big moment in the history of civil rights. So here's the Warren Court. This is the official portrait, Earl Warren in the center. They are credited with a lot of 4 key landmark decisions, expanding the protections for defendants' rights, voting rights, freedom of speech. The court's decisions collectively strengthened equal protection under the law, and these decisions reshaped American society toward a greater sense of social justice. Now, we can look back on that in this day and age and realize that, well, this was the right side of history. But it's good to remind ourselves that Warren's position was, controversial. And there was a lot of hate out there, and there were death threats, and there were these impeach Warren billboards and flyers, and so that hate was strong then. It's still strong now. So that's what Earl Warren, he took a stand, and that's very impressive that he did that. And he was a calculating political guy to be governor, and you had to be. So he knew what he was getting into, and he did it anyway because it was the right thing to do. I want to step back a moment and just take a quick look at a timeline of key civil rights moments in the 20th century. And in red, in the middle there, is the Brown versus Board decision of '54. As you can see, when Pat and Earl Warren were having their conversations. And shortly after Brown versus Board, we have Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott. We have the lunch counter sit-ins, the freedom rides, Martin Luther King, the Voting Rights Act, ultimately, and the Civil Rights Act in '64 and '65, where it was all leading to that. So you can just see that the Brown versus Board decision was, in a way, I believe, a linchpin to a lot of other things that occurred. Now, when the Warrens moved to D.C., Pat and Marge did not join them. They stayed in California, and he ended up serving 2 other California governors after Warren. And he also ended up being a lecturer at Sacramento State. He taught criminal justice, and he worked as a parole officer, and he worked as a prison psychotherapist. And in his criminal justice classes, he really focused on sort of the humanistic part of criminal justice and rehabilitation. And he wrote about the importance of attempting to understand other people and the ripple effect through society that a positive attitude would have as his students went out into the workforce. And he was beloved for that. He was a beloved professor. And here's a clipping from the time that talks about just that. He and Warren talked about these issues of incarceration and rehabilitation. So that is another part of their conversations. And it's interesting to contrast that with where we are today with prisons. A lot of them are run as for-profit private enterprises, and I think we've lost some of that sense of rehabilitation. So that was a heady time period in the 60s, and Pat was a part of that. These next couple photos, so these are 2 Warren children with Pat at an event, presumably. Here's another shot of Pat with, I don't know where this is. It looks like it could be the governor's mansion, and he's with a current patrol officer of that day. So here are the 2 governors that Pat worked for after Earl Warren, Governor Goodwin Knight, and then Governor Edmund Brown, the father of Jerry Brown. And we were able to find these letters, and it just showed how close the Pattersons were with these families that they served, and they exchanged these warm holiday cards and greetings. People were drawn to Pat. He had a warmth, and people just wanted to talk to him. There was just something about that, and this is, to me, just evidence of that kind of understated, subtle manner that he had. In summing this up, the relationship between Patterson and Warren was extraordinary. It was a friendship that cut across all major demographic boundaries of the time: age, race, education, wealth, social position, and it was a friendship of kindred souls. Again, maybe I need to check my romanticism on this, but I'm going to stay with that. I think that's a great story, and I believe the record does bear that out. So I was glad to stumble upon this story. Pat led a rich life. He typified American fable, the self-made man, and it must have been difficult in that age to go from New Orleans. He was orphaned at age 11 in New Orleans, but he was propelled upward. He had an innate optimism and a generosity of spirit and a really gentle personality, and these seem like artifacts. So now this next slide is a little video clip, and this is a bit of a tearjerker for me. Earl Warren had 3 heart attacks in 1974. He retired from the court in 69, and he was near the end. And he asked Pat and Marge to fly from Sacramento to D.C. to have a meeting. Presumably their last meeting. And they flew out, and the couples had a really lovely reunion. And at one point, according to the Cray biography, Pat bravely told Warren, "You and I have got a lot of places still to go," and that's sweet. And then when the visit ended, the two couples embraced, and the two men were in tears. And so this is Pat talking about that last visit, and it's cool because you can see how he spoke, and this is kind of gentle way he spoke.
Warren suffered 3 heart attacks in 1974. On July 2nd, he was admitted to Georgetown University Hospital. A week later, Pat Patterson came to visit.
It was the best visit that I've ever had with Earl Warren. And the whole time he was governor, I said we had good visits and sat and talked. But tears came in our eyes because he said, "We've had a lot of good discussions." And at that particular time that we were talking all this, Mrs. Warren came in and asked us did we need anything to drink, anything to talk, coffee, anything. And he said, "No, we're just having a good time. We're thinking about what we're going to do when I get out of this bed." We were the last one to visit. He told me this on his bed. He says, all the problems, all the legal problems, all the legislative problems. And he said, it was a good life, wasn't it?
In closing, I just, bring up these civil rights icons, and I just want to, if you leave here tonight, think about how far we've come from John Brown and Lincoln and to John Lewis there in the lower right, and you could put Warren in this group as well, and so their story is part of this larger story, and Pat is a hero of mine, and I want to thank you for the chance to share this.